Hi, everyone. My name is Rocco Rossi. I have the great privilege of being the president and CEO of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce. This is the next in our series of webinars on helping you and your members and your organizations navigate through the uncharted waters of the COVID-19 crisis. We're delighted today to be talking to a real pillar of the Canadian supply chain. CN is a longtime member and partner of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce and the Chamber movement more broadly nationally. Just before we get Sean Finn on, though, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping and a couple of updates. Obviously, we had to reschedule our webinar earlier this morning with Minister Ng. You'll be getting notice of the new date and time for that shortly. In the meantime, Thursday, we have Premier Ford coming, as well as Minister of Economic Development, Job Creation and Trade, Vic Fedeli. So you won't want to miss that. On our website, occ.ca, right on the homepage, is a link to a survey we're undertaking with a few others to really find out what you're prioritizing, what you think needs to be prioritized in the gradual reopening of the economy. So looking for your ideas, your input, so we can better advocate at all levels of government for what is going to be required to build the confidence of our companies, our employees, and our consumers, and ensure that we make the reopening as safe and successful as possible. So again, check that out at occ.ca. And on the 19th, we've got another phenomenal webinar coming up. This one will have leaders from GM, from Longo's, to have a look at how essential services, the grocery business, have been managing while others have been locked down, and also to look at what conditions, what they're seeing, and what other key companies and sectors of the economy are seeing as conditions to move forward. You'll definitely want to be part of that as well. And now just checking on a technical difficulty, seeing where Mr. Finn is. There he is currently muted. You know, aside from being an incredible business person and leader in the Canadian
I'm here. Rocco, I'm here.
Hello, Sean. How are you doing?
I apologize. We couldn't find the password, so I apologize.
Not at all. I've been saying amazing things about you. I'm going to have to repeat myself now so that you hear it directly. Look at, aside from being an incredible businessman, if you look up chamber volunteer in the dictionary, you see the picture of this guy. He has headed up the Montreal Board of Trade. He's headed up the Quebec Chambers of Commerce. He's been chair of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. So there is no one who has been more committed to the chamber movement, along with everything else that he does. The SVP, Executive Vice President at CN Rail, a former mayor, so someone committed to public service. Stop. We can go on and on, but I'm going to turn it over to him to give us a few opening remarks, and then we'll be in conversation with Sean Finn for the rest of the hour.
Good. Again, Rocco, thank you very much, and my apologies for being a few minutes late. It's a great opportunity to talk to you and to the members of the Ontario Chamber about you know, what we're doing at CN and the way we've performed the last 8 or 9 weeks through this pandemic. But obviously, you know, it's a pleasure to be with you. I think that you know, the Chamber plays a key role, the Ontario Chamber, in the activity of all your members and the economy of the province. of Ontario. And I think that Rocco, under your leadership, the chamber has done some really important things. And I think you've ensured that the voice of both the members, but also people involved in the chamber are well heard. So your contribution, both the province of Ontario, but also to all of Canada. I think that when Rocco speaks at Canadian Chamber events, or when his voice is being heard on any issues that might be important for the province of Ontario and the greater region, I think it resonates with elected officials, with decision makers, and I want to thank you for that. We're a very proud member of the Ontario Chamber. We have been for many years, and I think that it's also important that all your members realize that as we got into this pandemic, but also as we get out, the Ontario Chamber will play an important role. It's important to all of us to be supportive of Rocco, but also supportive of the chamber movement. And it's a subtle way of saying, make sure you pay your membership and that we renew our memberships, because when we need the Ontario Chamber, they're always there for us. So I want to make sure that that goes both ways. So Rocco, those are my initial comments.
Well, thank you very much, Sean, and I'm very proudly wearing my CN 100 pin today, so it's a mutual admiration society. Let's kick it off. Look, we're 2 months plus into this lockdown. How is CN doing, and more broadly, how are you seeing the supply chain during this time of lockdown?
Yeah, I think that it's important for people on the webcast to realize that CN is operating the railway, so the railway remains fluid, and we are serving both the Canadian economy, and more importantly, our customers, and we're ensuring that the goods that we need, on a daily basis for our livelihood, are finding their way to drugstores and grocery stores, in the province of Ontario. Give you one indication, we have moved record amount of grain during the first quarter of this year, in the month of April. And it might say something about how much stress baking people are doing, because the grain gets obviously milled into flour, and flour is then sold in our grocery stores for people to be baking bread as they're at home right now. But so a demand for our services in certain commodities, grain, coal, what we call domestic containers, which go from, as you know well, from either a ship or a plant onto a truck, into a yard where it's loaded onto a train, brought to another yard, for example, in Brampton or in Montreal or elsewhere, and then delivered by truck to local grocery stores or convenience or pharmacies. So in both cases, that remains strong. Now, with the auto plants being closed in the U.S. For a good part of the month of April, obviously automotive is a bit slower, but and we expect the month of May to have probably a bit of a bottoming out of the slowdown, and then pick up again to find our way back to a recovery. Maybe not complete recovery as quick as we thought initially, but a recovery leading into the fall of 2020.
Sean, you referenced the auto. Also, oil by rail was a big part of the business. You just had your first quarter meeting and at the end of April, and JJ and the whole team presented results that were still quite robust despite that, and despite the fact that we'd all suffered through the blockades earlier. What were the key elements of that? Clearly grain was part of it, but part of it is how you operate, how you flex, the culture that you've built. What are the key elements, and what lessons can we take from that?
Well, I think that the quarter itself was obviously impacted by a 22-day blockade in Belleville, Ontario. A legal blockade, was nothing to do with CN. It was not an issue between CN and the First Nation communities. It was very much supportive of the challenges they're having in BC with the pipeline. But we were the target of these blockades. We're not just First Nation blockades. We had other parties involved also. But that's a good example, be it the blockade or our work disruption we had in November, The fact that we have invested large amounts of capital in ensuring we have the right number of locomotives, investing in our track capacity across the network, because as you know, our capacity is often tied to the most weakest link. So it's important we build resilience and capacity in the network. And finally, making sure that we had like I said, locomotives and equipment to do that. I think those investments, which represent almost $10 billion over the last 3 years, essentially every dollar of revenue we earn, 25 cents go back into the network as capital expenditures to maintain our network and to develop the capacity. That builds resilience that is then available to be used during more challenging conditions during the months of January, February, and March in the prairies, but also is available to use to recover from unforeseen interruptions to our network. In the case of the strike, we could plan a bit more of the unforeseen interruptions, so we were able to stage our equipment in a way to recover quicker. The blockades were impromptu, were not planned, so a bit of a more of a reaction, but notwithstanding that, we recovered relatively well from the blockades, both in Western Canada and Eastern Canada, so we got the traffic moving again. And then we were hit by, obviously the impact of COVID-19. But I must say, the impact on CN, because our employees and 25,000 employees, 17,000 employees are still coming to work every day. And through the pandemic, we were able to continue to recover from the blockades. And typically, as the traffic would pick up normally in the month of March, especially for grain and some domestic containers intermodal, we were in a position, thanks to our employees coming to work every day and making sure they were doing so in a safe and healthy environment, we were able to deliver a pretty strong first quarter in view of our challenges. I think can't underestimate right now that our employees are coming to work every day. We have about 5,000 employees who are working from home, and that's because they can do so. But you can imagine, Rocco, a locomotive conductor and engineer can't work from home. Somebody who maintains track or repairs a crossing or signal system can't work from home. If you're a rail traffic controller in the center in Edmonton or in Homewood, Illinois, you can't work from home. So all these employees are coming to work. And our number one job is to make sure that we have a safe and clean and healthy environment for them, which we've succeeded in having, I must say. And we've gone as far as, I've been with people working in the yard, and I visit yards quite often. I was in the yard in Tashawa and Montreal, where we see our employees coming to work. They're doing so in a safe fashion. But we started our own hand sanitizing production line to produce hand sanitizers in a tissue format and baggies to send to our network across North America, so our employees could get the cab of locomotive and clean the cab if they had to. Between the crews, but we cleaned them themselves, obviously, but also they could do an extra step. And, last thing I'd say is, we're making sure that people are self-distancing, relatively easy to do in a large intermodal yard or yard in Toronto, but when you're in a cab of locomotive, the conductor and engineer are about 6 feet apart. So we have to sequence how they get the locomotive in a way so they kept that distance. And once they're in the cab, they stay safe. One last thing, we decided to add to our personal protection equipment for all our employees as of last Friday, an obligation to wear a mask. So people at CN, if you come to headquarters or an office in Ontario or a yard, if people are interacting in close proximity, they are required to wear masks when they come to work. So they've all been equipped, and we ordered, sufficient amount of masks to make sure we have an inventory to get us all the way to this fall, and we continue to order some. So I must say we've taken a series of steps, Rocco, to make sure the railway is continues to operate, and that's helped us have a very strong quarter in April, because by doing that, we could move the grain and the coal as it was being delivered by customers to us to get it to market.
Those are strong messages and a strong example, because confidence for our employees and for consumers more generally in the economy as we reopen are going to be key. And so hearing from those who are successfully able to have their employees come every day, not be afraid because they see their employer is taking every reasonable step to keep them safe, is going to be really, really important. Look, CN is not just a backbone of the Canadian supply chain. You're a North American-wide company, and clearly with the border issues, even with essential services. Give us a flavor for what's happening at the border. What does that chain look like? What issues have maybe come up, and what do you foresee going forward as we move out of this?
Yeah, Rocco, I think that, for us, the border is a daily occurrence. We have trains, about 50 trains a day in each direction going across the border. A substantial amount of value of goods, as we all know well, transit over the border. A couple of things. The border, you recall from 9/11, when the border was essentially shut down for 3 or 4 days. We were all a bit surprised by all that. And in the months that followed 9/11, very quickly, we were able, with both the Canadian government and the US border protection, to ensure that every single train that goes through the Canada-US border goes through a VACUS machine. So think about, the Paul Tellier tunnel between Sarnia and Port Huron, where the train goes across the border. The X-ray machine, it's called a VACUS machine, that's been installed, has been put on the Canadian side of the border because the grade of the tunnel is such that when you slow down a train, it wouldn't make it out the other side of the tunnel going to the US. So it's important we all know that, we have 5 large border crossings at CN. Every single container or a rail car that goes across the Canada-US border by train goes through that X-ray machine. So it's a very secure way, excuse me, of moving goods across the border. Trucks, as you know, is probably 7 to 10%. So I'm not saying it's not as secure, but there's not the same level of comfort when it comes to security at the border by both US Customs and Canadian Customs. Because it's so important to us, and because we like to promote the fact that Canada and Ontario is the gateway to North America, and if you bring your goods through Prince Rupert, Vancouver, Halifax into Toronto, and then down to the Chicago into the US, you're going to be able to get access to US markets quicker than going through Long Beach, California, or New York, where there's congestion. So you get into a Canadian port, somewhat less congested. You get on the railway in the case of Halifax or Prince Rupert on CN. In Vancouver, you have 2 choices, CN and our friends at CP. You bring your goods into the US across the border, and you can deploy very quickly into large portions of the US consumer base. So that's how important the border is to us. So you can imagine, as we saw early on in the pandemic, when the Canadian government and the US government announced they were contemplating taking measures at the border, we were already prepared because we have a pandemic plan was in place. We started working on it back in January. To us, it was no surprise that we had to quickly interact with the various port authorities at every single border crossing to make sure they knew who we were again, that we're going across with our train crews, but also have the recognition that we are the essential example of essential services, or the best example of essential services. And the fact that we can make that message clearly understood by both the US and Canadian border authorities have made the border for us extremely fluid. We've had no issues. We made sure that paperwork was in place, that our train crews could answer questions before they got to the border. And the fact that we were exempt, that's one thing from a government level, but you always want to make sure that local border crossing authorities understand the train is coming and what's on the train. So I must say, in the 9 weeks since we started this, we've had no issues at the border. Our trains are going across fluidly. There's been no delays caused by both trains going south or north. So therefore, it's a good example of how Canada can be the gateway to North America and to the US. But also that by having strong relationships with both local border crossing authorities, but also in Washington, in Ottawa, and in your case in Queen's Park, for that the elected officials and the authorities understand the amount of trade that goes from the province of Ontario into the US as being essentially crucial to the manufacturing base in Ontario. Was not a big issue and was very quickly understood. And I must say, Team Canada, both through our provincial governments, through the chamber movement, through people like Scotty Greenwood at the Canadian American Business Council, who understand the importance of the border. So we had a very strong voice coming from Canada. And I must say it was both very clearly heard and understood by our U.S. counterparts how important the border is both to our Canadian economies, but also to the economies and the consumer base in the U.S. who consume goods that are produced, for example, in Ontario.
Right. So the border is in pretty good shape for you. You're an essential service. You haven't had to shut down. Your employees are showing up. What has been the biggest challenge of the pandemic thus far for CN?
Yeah, I would say that we all come to work every day, from our CEO all the way down to the people who work in the yards, keeping our 25,000 workers in a safe, healthy environment, communicating continuously with them. We must communicate with our customers, our employees, and stakeholders across the network. So to answer your question, the daily discussion in our offices and in the yards is, making sure our employees are coming to work and that there is no hesitation about being safe and healthy. Secondly, that customers are aware of what we're doing, that the railway is running and we're here to serve them and move their goods to market and not miss an opportunity. And lastly, making sure that everybody knows what we're doing. So we have made a pretty big effort, and you've probably seen some of the communication, Rocco, of keeping stakeholders, mayors, elected officials in Ottawa, in every provincial capital, in the states we carry on business and in Washington, what exactly we're doing, how we're keeping our customers informed, and how we're making sure that we're staying safe. The fact that we've had, some experience on, incident response when we have unfortunate incidents on a network, it wasn't a big jump for us a couple of years to put in place a business resumption plan that had a pandemic plan. So, Steve Covey, who was our chief security officer, started having conversations around getting ready for the pandemic back in January of 2020. So in some cases earlier, and some governments were doing so. We briefed our board twice, one in January and one again in March. So the challenge of making sure that all of us were aware that we had to communicate continuously, but also remain nimble enough and available to react quickly. So, if people needed to get, goods moved, surgical masks or equipment that we were able to pick up a container somewhere and without giving it priority, make sure it made the train, got on the train and got deliveries in time. So obviously protecting that. And, to think that we would have said 6 months ago, we would be producing our own protective hand sanitizer kits for our crews, wasn't something that would have been natural, but it's typical railway, typical CN. How do we do things? How do we innovate? Because we have a simple goal. We move our customers' goods to point A to point B safely, but it's a team sport. You need employees doing so, you need the supply chain doing so. So I think our biggest challenge is making sure we don't drop our guard about providing a safe environment and, communicating on an ongoing basis. Even today, the mediums are simple, but the message has to be clear, because you can clearly get people, confused or mixed messages if you don't make sure it's done strongly. So a strong group of communicators, both internally and externally, of people have helped us make sure that our communications are transparent and with conviction, and also with a clear understanding. When we do have issues, we react quickly to them. So if we have a COVID-19 case anywhere on the property, we've been very proactive in, isolating the people, making sure we take steps to then clean the environment quickly and then reopen our premises in a safe fashion.
I have to say, I've been blown away by your communications. I wish I got as many updates from my son as I do from CN. I feel like I'm on top of everything. You said, look, this is a team sport, and I know that there was a lot of anguish during the blockades and the strike before the pandemic hit. And clearly part of that team sport, and we're getting a bunch of questions in. I know we were going to talk about it anyway, but from my dear friend Jerry McCartney in London, did you feel vis-a-vis the team sport notion well supported by the governments, by the federal government, by the provincial governments, and clearly, there are people now out there with a playbook on how to try to exploit the system? And do you feel there's a response in place now that we can face this into the future?
Yeah, I think, Rocco, very good question. And my regards go to Jerry and to all of you also, making sure that you're all safe and your families are safe. But And Jerry, like you, Rocco, have been a very, very big supporter of the railway and understands what we do on a daily basis. So, I think that I must say I was quite surprised the level of attention we got during the blockades, and that was probably a precursor to having my phone number and some key people in various provinces almost on speed dial, because I would have been speaking to the Deputy Minister of Transportation, Michael Keenan, through the blockades on a daily basis, all the way through the month of February. So as we were, moving into the steps leading up to concrete actions on the pandemic, the fact that we had very open communications with policy decision makers and elected officials in every provincial capital, from the Premier's offices to the Chief of Staff, to Minister of Transport, Minister of Public Security, Minister of Economic Development, and the same applies in the U.S. for governors and state officials. So those relationships that you build, as you know well, throughout the year are important. So, you can access people and you're more calling them to say, how can we help? What are our issues? What are your issues? So I must say, to every province that we carry on business, they've been very receptive. I can give you one example I think is worthwhile because it's very concrete. Premier Doug Ford and his office have been very, very open and very transparent and ask us, what can we do to help? And you can imagine, this is a good example about asking governments. We're not looking for handouts. We want our customers, obviously, to make sure that their businesses are sustainable. So the help that the federal government and the provincial governments are giving to our customers to make sure that businesses continue to operate and can meet demand is very important. In our case, we're less looking for financial support, but we're going to go into a season of capital work on our track. And you can imagine, as we have a bit less, we have capacity, a bit less density on the track because there's a bit less volume in some areas. It's a good time for us to be doing, improvements to our track because there's less impact to our operating railway or to our operating trains. Well, in that case, we often need permits accelerated. We need some help in doing things. So in Ontario and other provinces and in Ottawa, we've been asked, what do you need? Without in any way minimizing the environmental assessment process. But if we're down to getting a permit to build a siding, or we need access to a permit to get some gravel or grading, we can do so on a quicker basis. And I must say that the province has been very helpful to us to accelerate that without in any way impacting the environmental assessment process. When it comes to Ottawa, Transport Canada have been very helpful, not in making the rules simpler, but you can imagine our train crews have to be certified every 3 years. So you imagine if you have a conductor and engineer who trains, who rules certification was coming due in February or March, we couldn't send him to a training center in Winnipeg to redo his rules. Well, we were successful in convincing Ottawa to extend the regulation for 6 months to allow our train crews. So we have a conductor who's been running a train for 30 years. It's not because he's 6 months behind in his recertification, he won't operate the train safely. But there has been a willingness and a clear engagement on the part of regulatory bodies, and policymakers, decision makers, to work with us to not bend the regulations, but make them realize that under the current reality, some things cannot be done. So I must say that both in Canada and US, it's been there. So I think, to your point, Rocco, when you have these relationships, when you're an honest broker with them, you're trying to find solutions which are not, just trying to draw benefit from the very unfortunate circumstances, you can get things done, and governments are receptive as long as you make the case honestly and in a transparent way. And you realize that with them, these are exceptional circumstances that require, in some cases, not just its CN being nimble, but also the regulators and our elected officials being nimble. I think in Canada, we've shown that. We've done a pretty good job in this area. There's more challenges dealing with the healthcare system than with the railways right now, but that's another matter.
I want to push a little bit further on that issue of the help, not financial, but just in speeding things up, because you've been a great corporate citizen, and clearly it's advantageous for the environment to transport more goods by rail. Clearly, we want to build in the recovery more capacity to do that. And for over 5 years, you've been patiently and assiduously putting the case forward for the Milton Multimodal Logistics Hub, something that the OCC and the Chamber movement in general is very, very supportive of. Where are we now, and how do we get government to bring this across the line?
Well, Rocco, thank you very much for raising that question. Also, thank you, the Ontario Chamber and all the members for your support on the Milton Logistics Hub. It's been very, very helpful, very efficient, and I must say that a good example of how, you know, the Chamber movement can be supportive, not just of a member, but of an important infrastructure program or asset for the greater the GTHA, but also for the province of Ontario. Because don't forget, Milton is
not asking for $1 of government money, public money. This is your private investment in a shovel-ready project.
That's right. And Rocco, Milton is not about Milton. Milton's about Canada. I told you before that, you know, you can imagine that if we're going to have containers coming in through the port of Halifax, Prince Rupert, and Vancouver, coming to the Greater Toronto area where these goods are being consumed by the population in Ontario, you need to have inland terminals. Brampton Intermodal Terminal is at capacity. There's not any room to expand. It is landlocked. And I appreciate your comments about Milton having been discussed for the last 5 years. But, you know, we got into this process. We said we'd see it through. So very happy to report that, as you know well, last summer, a year ago in July, we had 5 weeks of hearings in Milton on the Logistics Hub. We addressed all the concerns that were raised. The panel of 3 eminent Canadians went away, tabled a report in January of this year, and recommended that the government proceed. There are conditions, and we are looking at those conditions very closely. We expect the panel and the agency, Environmental Assessment Agency, to provide a project assessment and report to Minister Wilkinson, the Minister of Environment. Because of the pandemic, the deadline for rendering a decision has been postponed from June 25th to September 25th, 90 days, so not that long. It will give us more time to work with decision makers. But, you know, if anything, between the work disruption, the blockade, and now the pandemic, the case for having, you know, an inland terminal in Milton to bring goods that consumers need on a daily basis to the GTHA and the distribution centers has probably been made even more so. So obviously, you know, we're very appreciative of all the comments made by the various people in the region. We have taken very seriously the recommendations and the concerns of the population in the Halton region. We have always tried to address their concerns and find a way to mitigate what's going on, what may happen from the terminal. We're very conscious of the issues dealing with trucks, and I think that if we're given the opportunity, like we will be with the panel, to bring forward the case why the terminal does not have you know, substantial negative environmental impact in and by itself, and that it brings benefits to the region of both having a very efficient and fluid logistics hub in the Greater Toronto area, but also, you know, goods are being delivered by containers into this area and then out by truck to either distribution centers or to your local drugstore, you know, local grocery store or local Canadian Tire. So obviously the case is important besides the jobs we're going to create. But I think, you know, we've been very patient, and we will continue to do so, to consider seriously. We've been in Milton for 100 years. We haven't been there for 5 years, 100 years. We're not going anywhere. As you know well, that's our main line that serves the U.S. So we'll continue the dialogue. If the permit, and we're looking forward to having a positive decision by the minister, is issued, we hope to start work on the terminal possibly in the fall of this year, if not early 2021. Have the terminal up and ready within a year, and then continue the dialogue with the great people of the Halton region of the city of Milton on how we make sure that CN you know, holds up to its end of the bargain of making sure that we operate this terminal in a way that has the least amount of impact to the residents of Milton and the greater Halton region.
I certainly remember back in my days in kindergarten, which was eons ago, that none of my peers when asked, what would you like to be when you grow up, say, I want to be part of the supply chain. And yet with the blockades, with the pandemic, with people understanding that grocery stores have to be stocked and pharmacies have to be stocked, I think there's a greater appreciation than ever before on the importance of supply chain and the importance of having the right and efficient kind of infrastructure for that. We've got a great question from the High Commissioner, Bangladesh, from Ottawa, watching us today, really wanting to get your sense of what do you see as potentially the big changes coming out of all of this for supply chain a year out and further here in Canada?
That's a great question, High Commissioner, and great to hear from you. There's no doubt that the need for governments, to be able to access, for example, medical protective equipment has raised the level of what a supply chain is. To see planes, parked, in airports in China and in India or elsewhere, waiting to have goods loaded and then brought to Canada or to the US or to North America. So I think that, Rocco, you said it very well. The term supply chain is better understood by people and realize that when the supply chain is for some reason weakened, it could impact the availability of goods, of food and other products that we need for our daily livelihoods in a very substantial way. So, the security of the supply chain, the fact that it's robust, it can sustain, be it natural disasters or be it unforeseen interruptions like we had here in Canada in February, really goes to the fact that we're raising that awareness. I think that, as more people realize that, we're having a dialogue about these supply chains. There's no doubt that, there will be changes to them. And that's what makes probably, a company like CN and our partners capable of adapting to these needs. So we fully expect that, Halifax, for example, which is the port of entry for containers coming into Canada on the East Coast, we'll find probably that more ships will be coming through that port than elsewhere. Secondly, we're going to see an uptake in probably containers as we come out of the other end of this pandemic, both in Prince Rupert and Vancouver. And it's very important. Supply chains are only as strong as their weakest link. And, sometimes the railway could be the weakest link. Sometimes it's our other supply chain partners. But if we have a approach of always looking at, goods from destination all the way from origin to destination, and we look at the partners, we make sure that all our partners have the tools, the capital investment, the infrastructure, which is a big issue for us in Canada, to be able to serve the supply chains, then we'll have a very robust way of getting goods into markets, both in Canada and in our case, like I said before, on CN into the US. But if we have, challenges in the Port of Vancouver, a bottleneck in Burnaby because we lack capacity, or we have a tunnel that we have to shut down for 20 minutes because we have to evacuate the diesel fumes and we have not upgraded to make it quicker, it's always astonishing to me, High Commissioner, you bring an elected official to visit a port and you show them where the bottleneck is. For example, in Vancouver, if a rowboat, I'll be nice, a sailboat shows up at a bridge and the bridge raises for the train, which has 12,000 feet of goods on the back of it, of cars and containers, the elected official says, why are we doing that? Well, because that is the rule. The boat reserves the entrance and it goes up and the train waits. Well, they often say that's unacceptable. Well, we say we agree. What can we do to make this better? So I'll say one thing. Supply chains are going to evolve. And my view would be the members of the chains who will be successful are those who together can look at how it impacts their businesses, where these so-called bottlenecks or issues are, and what are we doing as a company, as governments, to make sure that we try and invest the capital to make our infrastructure more efficient, because people have choices, and I think Canada is well positioned to be able to import goods from India and China. And to serve the consumer base both in Canada and the US, because we have a supply chain which is very robust, and the partners have a tendency of talking to each other because, for example, the Canadian Chamber or the Ontario Chamber will always always find a way to bring us to the table and say, let's talk about the issues, and then help us advocate. In the case of Milton, there is a need for the Milton terminal. And if the case can be made that it can be done while respecting environmental issues, then, this is a need. This is a basic infrastructure need for the GTHA, which is important because people are consuming these goods in your province and in your region.
Follow-up question from the audience. Prince Rupert and Vancouver, a big part of that was and expanded capacities to deal with trade from China. Obviously, things have gotten complicated between the US and China. What do you at CN foresee in terms of that ongoing supply chain relationship with the Far East, and in particular with China?
Yeah, I think I'll say two things. Has the plants reopened in China? There was a modest uptake of the traffic coming. So we're not seeing, the total resumption of the levels of traffic, both coming through Vancouver or Prince Rupert. But we expect it to come. I think that, as the pandemic comes to it will never come to an end, I'm assuming right now, but comes to a certain amount of stability, or people getting comfortable. The consumers, the stores, and as the economy reopens, we'll see an uptake in that. And it's important that the ports of Rupert that has capacity. Rupert is a very efficient port, and there's a lot of money being invested in Vancouver. So I'm confident that from Vancouver, we're ready for that demand. In Halifax, there's capacity now. It's not at capacity, nor is our track. We can move extra goods there. So I think that we're well positioned, but we have people on the ground, Rocco, in China. Their job is to work with our customers there to make sure that we understand how the flows are going to come, that we're ready for them. So again, it's important for us to get that intelligence, that data from our customers, both in Europe and in Asia, that we share it with the ports of Vancouver, that we share it with our trucking partners also, and that we realize that as these flows come back. But we expect to see, again, some weakness in the second quarter, probably a recovery in the third quarter, not as quickly as we thought initially, but hopefully we'll see a recovery leading up to the fourth quarter of this year. And again, levels may not be back to where they were in 2019, but we think that the supply chain in Canada is very efficient, and there is a willingness on the part of overseas shippers to use the Canadian ports as their gateway to North America.
Thank you, Sean. Switching back to Ontario question, beyond Milton, what is CN's plans for recovery in Ontario?
Yeah, I would say obviously making sure at all times we have the infrastructure, the employees, the locomotives to be able to serve the customers in the province of Ontario. Working closely with the manufacturing base in Ontario, which still remains very strong, to make sure that we have a clear understanding of how they're going to be ready for recovery. Obviously, the automotive industry will come back, and we're a big player when it comes to moving parts from Southern Ontario into the U.S. and then finished products from the U.S. back to Ontario. So, I'm sure that my colleagues in marketing, James Carnes and Keith Reardon, who you know well, we'll be talking to customers, anticipating their needs, and making sure that we have the capacity and also the room in our yards to do this, to face this demand. Obviously, it'll be hopefully a gradual return, which will help us do it in a better fashion. But we're going to make sure that we're ready, poised, and available to react quickly. And even today, Rocco, as we talk to customers and we see an opportunity, one carload at a time, one container at a time to move product, with customers, we're going to be doing so. So being very nimble. We're a big organization. Trains is very much also a team sport that is a network business. But I can tell you that my marketing colleagues and sales colleagues are on the property as we speak, talking to our customers, trying to figure out what the needs will be, and to be ready for them when they call us, because there will be no excuse. And in the meantime, trying to find opportunities for our customers to get their goods to market helps them be successful. So I think we have a role to play to make sure we're ready when the time comes.
Sean, grouping a couple of questions that all go around the sort of the reopening here in Ontario. you were an essential service from the beginning, never had to shut down, but clearly you were pulling up lessons. What lessons would you share to those employers who are now in the midst of reopening? What are the key lessons that you could share so that we can all be successful in the reopening?
Yes, we're very much, in that stage right now. Our 17 or 18,000 operating employees never stopped coming to work. But we always made sure that when they did, I'll come back to my example of a rail traffic control center. These people are sitting in an office in Edmonton and they're dispatching trains. So pretty important. It's the brains of the network. I think that we had to make sure that their environment was, I said to you before, safe, healthy, and clean, that they saw us reacting very quickly. And as they're walking in the building today, they're seeing other colleagues coming to work also. So we've had put in place a very robust return to work plan, which is gradual, which has 4 basic conditions, very simply. At all times, we have to be convinced, because safety is a core value at CN, they're providing a safe, healthy, and clean environment, and if not, that we take steps immediately to address that. Secondly, that we are relying on the advice coming from public health authorities. We're in 8 jurisdictions in Canada, 18 in the US. They all have different rules, but we're aware of the rules. We're making sure that we're applying them on a facility by facility basis. Thirdly, that at all times we respect obviously the rules and regulations that require, certain, in our case in Montreal, the rules right now are a bit different than elsewhere in Quebec or elsewhere in Ontario. And then finally, I think, Rocco, this is important. If you make sure your employees understand and your board understands that you have a plan, which is not just based on science, but is also based on, practically making sure that, people will have masks, that you'll make sure there'll be self-distancing, that, when there is an issue of a little flare up or, somebody is not feeling well, that, people realize very quickly we can react. And I must say at CN, in my case, I've insisted, we have a daily call, not just in my case, of my direct reports, and they must have a daily call with their employees. So there's nobody in my function, which is corporate services, that right now on a daily basis is not having a direct interaction with their immediate superior. And I think that creates a level of trust. It also creates understanding of what the needs of the employees are. And I think that, we're not perfect. We'll have good days and bad days, but I guess my advice to anybody would be, you need to have a plan. You need to make sure that you're communicating it, in an openly, transparent, and consistent basis, that you have conviction that you can do these things. That's important. I guess we, the railroaders, sometimes can be a bit arrogant, so we can be convinced that we're, we can do these things, and we try and make sure we do it. So we have, very broad resources. So lucky for us, if you're a small business, more challenging. But I think a lot of the lessons learned are pretty basic. So to figure out, how you're going to be able to adapt to the new environment and, to be able to meet your customers' needs while still respecting the fact that you want to make sure that your employees and that your other customers feel that your environment is safe. So I've been watching, from a distance. I have a certain, affinity with small businesses across Canada, and I watch how some businesses have been very innovative to find ways to serve customers during the pandemic, be it restaurants or other people, but also seeing, how people are being innovative. Right now, curbside pickup in Ontario, but, in some cases in Quebec, people are going into stores, in areas in Quebec that have been, had very few cases of COVID-19. They are finding ways to work with their customers to start up the economy again and make the customers feel, one, welcome back in their retail store or their business, and secondly, that the customer feels that the owner of the business is ensuring the safety of its employees and other customers. So that's a question of, just being very transparent with them. But thinking of innovative ways of doing that is important for our business, and I think small businesses play a role. And the chamber movement obviously can help in that area by having these webcasts, but also share best practices with businesses so they can learn from each other.
One final question that's come up is, you go across Canada. Has there been any difficulties generated by the fact that different provinces may be opening at different paces and with slightly different rules, and what complications does that add for you?
Yeah, well, CN was in a unique situation, being very early on, not at all levels, though, so it was a challenge in some provinces, an essential service. We had to explain what that meant. And I had to make sure our employees did not abuse that. Obviously, if you're a track maintainer living in Hawkesbury, Ontario, and you want to come work in Dorval, Quebec, at the border, you need a letter saying that you were essential service and here's what you did for the railway. So we're unique in that area. And I must say, very quickly, every province supported that because they realized how important the supply chain was to their economies. But as we had issues come up, we addressed them quickly. But you have to engage. I think it's important that, understand what the rules are. But we were very lucky at CN. But there were issues, in some cases where we had people going back and forth, and we had to make sure that we very quickly intervened to reassure the provincial governments we knew what we were doing. But I'm hopeful that as we move on, it's important our borders remain fluid, both within Canada, but also with the US. And that's why it's so important that deconfinement is done in a gradual fashion so we don't have to take a step back. And I think that quickly the provincial governments will come to a view that they can balance their public safety while reopening the borders to allow tourists to go to PEI and people transition through New Brunswick. But you must be sympathetic without being overly reactive to the fact that if their cases are going down, you want to make sure that you're not bringing in people that are not respecting the rules, and that it's not our right, to go to another province. It's something that we have a right to do to the extent that we do so in a safe fashion. So I am also aware of the importance that the provinces do so in a gradual fashion. But they're going to come to a point, Rocco, where we have to reopen to allow various businesses to restart and tourism to start up again. Canadians will probably travel more in Canada going forward, and we can do so in a safe fashion, but we'll have to do so gradually and respect the fact that some regions in a province and some areas are a bit concerned about bringing in the virus into an environment that they've found now is contained, and they're slowly but reopening their schools and their businesses, right?
And with your chamber hat back on, what do you suggest? What do you recommend we should be asking our leaders, the Prime Minister and the premiers, in terms of the key priorities to move us forward?
Well, there's no doubt that we have to get the governments to realize that the businesses have been very much impacted the last 9 weeks. That some are on the verge of not being able to reopen or to restart. So having programs to allow businesses to maybe change how they do business. I'm assuming that some of the businesses we had before will have to innovate into something new, but be supportive of the small business in Canada. Reduce the red tape when you're changing from one industry to another. Regulations have to be adaptive. I think we have to be very patient, understanding with how we deal with regulatory environments and make it easier for people to rethink their businesses and restart. And I think that, it's always a challenge, as Rocco, not very many of our elected officials across Canada have ever operated a small business. So part of your job is to make sure that the language of small business is understood by our elected officials, that, this is the motor of Canada's economy. We at CN play a key role, but as we all know very well, small businesses are what makes our economy thrive in Canada, and we have to be very understanding and sympathetic. And hopefully, you at the Ontario Chamber, the Canadian Chamber, the whole movement will be a loud voice to elected officials in every province and in Ottawa about the need to keep the support there, to find ways to get the regulatory burdens alleviated, to get rid of the red tape and to make it a lot faster for people to restart their businesses, and to look at the regulations we have, which don't really address like a safety concern or a health concern, but have just been there for years. So maybe it's a chance, Rocco, to have the Chamber lead a review of the regulatory environments, not just in Ontario, but also in Ottawa and elsewhere.
Thank you very much. You've been incredibly generous with your time, and over and above us thanking, I understand that you want to make an additional announcement. We've frozen. Sean? Apparently it's been frozen. That's unfortunate, but Sean was going to announce that on behalf of CN and through the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, they were going to be making a very generous donation to Feed Ontario. which helps the food banks across the province. And again, Sean, just want to thank you and your colleagues at CN for the generosity, for your time, for all that you do in the economy and what you do for the chamber movement. We'll be having a recording of this on our website, occ.ca. Again, Thursday, the Premier and the Minister of Finance. Big thanks to our sponsors, Bruce Power, Canada Life, the Chamber's Plan. To all of you, stay safe, and we'll see you at the next one. And in the meantime, occ.ca, fill out that survey to help us advocate for the best preconditions for a successful rollout. Thanks to all of you for attending, and stay safe.